Welcome to the lecture on how PHP works. Let's understand how PHP works in a web application and what role it plays in this web application. We'll relate back to concepts that we have learned like client-server model, request response, and then we'll try to use those terminologies to explain how PHP works. Okay, so let's move on. So after completing this lecture, you should be able to explain how PHP works in the web. This is a very important topic that you need to learn, because if you cannot explain how PHP works, then the point of understanding PHP is gone. So conceptually you should know how PHP works and also what job it does in the whole web application. Okay, so let's move on and understand this in the next topic. So we have seen this definition wherein the web browser will send a request and then the web server will access that file and post that response. This we have understood in the request response pattern. So let's elaborate this and understand how the PHP will come in picture and help this whole scenario. So if you see on the right hand side in the diagram, I have embedded the PHP code here. So whenever a web browser is requesting for a PHP code, whatever code it is, okay, we haven't gone through the PHP details, but imagine it's a PHP code. So web browser is requesting for that PHP code. He will send the request to the web server. The web server will execute this PHP code, generate the HTML file, whatever the content of the file is, and then that content is basically pushed back as a response to the web browser. However, we haven't discussed about the file names and all those things, but the web browser only understands HTML. It doesn't understand what is PHP. So if you give the PHP to execute to the web browser, it doesn't really understand it, because PHP is a server-side code and PHP is interpreted by the server and convert it into an HTML code. Whatever code it is that you write in the PHP code is converted into HTML, and that HTML content is given to the web browser so that web browser can display onto the browser. Okay, so couple of things that you have to understand here how PHP works. The PHP code executes on the server. That's the point number one. Whenever the PHP code is executed onto the web server, the converted code is an HTML code, and the HTML code is given back to the web browser so that web browser can display that code. And the role of PHP here is basically to connect to a database. That's basically the main role, and fetch the data from the database or access a file, or does all the things that we have learned for the PHP, like accepting the cookies, maintaining the session management, doing the security, sending emails. All this is done from the PHP code itself. Okay, so that's the purpose of having a PHP code sitting at the web server and doing all those transactions. So a proper definition of how PHP works we can explain like this. A web browser requests the PHP file and the web server will execute the PHP code and generates the HTML file content, and then it sends that content to the web browser, and then web browser will able to print the HTML code. So one question that you can think is, what if there is no conversion of PHP code into an HTML code? What if web server just give the PHP code to the web browser? What happens at the web browser? The web browser will print the PHP code. It doesn't understand how to interpret it, so it will just show the PHP code. The interpretation of PHP code to HTML code happens at the web server. So remember this definition, remember this concept, how PHP works. It's very, very important. When you start writing the code, when you understand these concepts, it is easy to relate back how things are magically happening on the web browser. Because when you try to access a PHP code from a web browser, you won't see a PHP code, but you'll see an HTML code. The reason behind is because of this concept. Okay, so I'll leave you with this definition. Remember it, by heart it, whatever it is which means comfortable to you, but make sure you are able to explain this definition to anyone who asks you how PHP works in the web. Okay, so let's move on. To summarize, by now you should be able to explain how PHP works in the web. Try to explain to your friends and see whether they can understand this concept or not. Okay, so when we start writing the PHP program, you will see how this works in the real time. So that's all for this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one.